Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here. I've got another Master Duel video for you. So today we're going to be doing yet another tier list, but this time instead of doing a deck tier list as far as the metagame goes, I wanted to do a meta tier list but for staple cards instead. So this is a question that I get asked relatively regularly on the channel is like, hey, I am new to the game / getting into Master Duel. What are the cards that I should craft that are staples, that are cards that can be used in every single deck? And while there are some general answers of cards that are good in pretty much every format we've had in Master Duel up to this point, there are also other staples that are very format dependent, and with the release of sprites in this latest selection pack, we've seen a huge format shift that has actually kind of really turned on its head like what staples I know that I'm putting in my decks, and I think a lot of people are putting in theirs as well. Even before sprites came out, I was talking a little bit in like the math mech meta of how like, oh, infinite impermanence isn't like super great right now, but then all of a sudden sprites come out and I'm playing 3 imperm in every single deck. So I figured I'd want to address this and talk about the current state of a lot of very commonly used cards in the current metagame. So again, this is going to be specifically a tier list for post-Spright metagame as far as like what cards are going to be good here. So before I dive into this tier list, let me quick mention once again, if you check out my Patreon, link in the description below, I did actually just add a new tier to that recently. That's going to be the coaching tier. So if you're interested in some one-on-one coaching sessions, definitely feel free to check that out. Again, linked in the description below. And even if you're not, that Patreon is still going to have some daily Master Duel content that's exclusive over there. So people who subscribe over there will be able to see that. And don't worry, if you get the coaching tier, then you also get that exclusive content for the entire month as well. So again, if you're interested in any of that, like I said, top link of the description is going to be the one to my Patreon, and you can find out more information right over there. But in any case, let's go ahead and get into the tier list. But before I do, I'm going to go ahead and describe what each of these tiers mean, because I just have them labeled S, A, B, C, and D. So cards that I put in the S tier, these are going to be cards that I would play in just about every single deck in Master Duel right now. Like literally probably 90% of decks or more in all of Master Duel should probably be playing at least 2 copies of cards that are in the S tier. It's going to vary kind of deck to deck as it just tends to do with staples, but generally speaking, yeah, S is for cards that go in 90% or more of decks. A tier is going to be cards that are like really, really good right now, but are a little bit more format dependent and or can't slot into every single deck. And more often than not for staples in the A tier, that's going to be because a lot of decks just don't have the room to play these kind of cards. Some decks have, just naturally due to the way that their engines are built, they have more or less room for tech cards. So A tier cards are staples that are good right now in particular, really good right now in particular, and or would be S if most decks had the ability to run them. B tier staples are going to be kind of a little bit more niche and specific, again, to this format, as well as including some cards that maybe not every deck can take advantage of, but a lot can. C tier, these staples are going to be more of what I like to call like quote-unquote side deck cards, where even in a best of one format like Master Duel, most of the time I probably wouldn't main deck this card. You still could, but I would put it in my side decks for tournaments and stuff moving forward. And then finally D tier, this bottom tier, these are going to be cards that like you could use right now and would be effective, but I think there are generally just better options, and or these would also be like side deck cards, but these would be more like redundant side deck cards. So if you're looking for some more additional hate in addition to whatever you're side decking, I'd turn to these D tier cards. And again, C and D tier cards are still cards you could main deck in like specific decks or in certain situations, but generally speaking, I would advise would be more of side deck cards. So right off the bat, we have Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. I think it's no one's surprise that this is going to be an S tier staple. I think pretty much every single deck can make use of this card. The only like current meta deck that I would advise against putting Ash Blossom in would probably be Runic variants, so like Runic Sprite and Runic Stun. Yeah, those cards generally just don't have enough room for Ash Blossom, and Ash Blossom, like, they'd rather just have like another Runic spell in the form of Disruption generally, but otherwise, pretty much every single deck wants to be playing Ash Blossom. Pretty much every single deck has a, some kind of effect that draws or searches cards, or summons from deck or foolishes, so Ash Blossom is always going to be live, and even if it's not live against like a specific deck, there is a certain earth insect that is around that will keep Ash Blossom very relevant for the entirety of the time that card is in Master Duel, but we'll get into that much later. So, Ash Blossom, yes, would absolutely call this an S tier staple. Joining Ash Blossom in the S tier staples is going to be Called by the Grave. This is another card that is pretty huge. It's a very good anti-disruption tool is how it's most commonly used, so, you know, your opponent goes to activate Ash Blossom or Maxi or something, then you can chain Call By, banish it out of the graveyard and negate it, and then you don't have to worry about it, you can continue your combo freely. Not only that, but Call By the Grave is also just good disruption in its own right. A lot of decks have cards that they want to send to the graveyard to either get back later or have an effect that activates in the graveyard, so Called By being able to both banish and negate the effects of that specific card, that's pretty huge. And there's a lot of decks that get really, really hampered by Call By for that exact reason, because it's a banish and a negate. So, Call By, generally speaking, you should have the 2 copies you're allowed in. Again, this is going to be like 90% or more of all decks in Master Duel. Alright, now we have Cosmic Cyclone. So, Cosmic Cyclone is a card that I've trash-talked a lot in the past. I really trash-talked it as an out to Runic Stun. I don't think Cosmic Cyclone, I think this card is a bad tech if you're looking to play it against Runic Stun, because Runic Stun has multiple spell and trap cards you want to address, right? Like, yes, we want to hit the fountain. Of course, we always want to hit the fountain with Cosmic Cyclone, but if we're up against Runic Stun, it's not just the fountain we have to worry about, we have the floodgates as well, and it's not uncommon at all for the Runic Stun deck to have access to multiple floodgates. So between at least one, if not more, floodgates and the Runic Fountain, banishing one card against Runic Stun is just not that great. However, I will say this. Cosmic Cyclone did actually get significantly better upon the release of Runic Spright. And the reason for that is because now the most prominent Runic deck that we're seeing doesn't have a whole lot of back row and floodgates that it's setting. The spell and trap that it kind of lives and dies by is Runic Fountain. Now, of course, they have the Spright engine as well, but yeah, Cosmic Cyclone, I will say, is a better tech now than it was previously, because again, it's much better against Runic Spright than it ever was against Runic Stun. Yeah, I think this card is complete garbage against Runic Stun, I'm not gonna lie, but against Runic Spright, it's a little bit better. I still don't think I personally would main deck it. I'm going to put Cosmic Cyclone in the C tier. I could honestly see it being at like the bottom of B tier in this particular meta. Before Runic Spright came out, I mean, this would have been an easy D tier, if that. But here, I'm going to put it in C tier. I am currently still not planning on main decking this card at all. Even with Runic Spright currently at full power. Now, next week, they are going to get hit by the ban list, and I think Cosmic Cyclone becomes even less viable in the main deck at that point. But even now, where Runic Spright is at full power, and we're expecting to see it everywhere, I'm honestly still not going to main deck it. I might side deck it. This is a format where I'd probably side deck it, unlike last format, but yeah, I'm going to put I always call it Runic. I'm going to put Cosmic Cyclone in C tier. Is it the worst cards you could play? No, but could you play better cards? Yes, absolutely. Alright, next up we have Dark Hole. So, I know what you're probably thinking, like, why are we even talking about Dark Hole? Like, Raigeki's at 2, Lightning Storm's at 3, we have Kaijus and Lava Golem. Why would Dark Hole ever be on, like, anyone's radar? This is actually not a bad format for a Dark Hole, believe it or not, because of Sprites. So, Sprites, and this is actually going to affect a number of cards that are on this staple tier list. Spright is a deck that plays very heads up, and what I mean by that is they put their disruptions out on the board pretty much 100% of the time, unless they have, like, you know, something generic like Ash Blossom or Maxi. Then they're going to be activating all of their effects, like, from the field. You know, their Spright Elf, their IP Masquerena, their Sprites Red and Carrot, so on and so forth. So these board wipes like Dark Hole, and even ones like Dark Hole that are kind of like mediocre, actually become more viable in a format like this. Now, granted, Dark Hole and a lot of these board wipe cards, but especially Dark Hole, is really only viable on, like, when you're going second on your first turn, because obviously if you play it while you have a board, you're going to lose your board as well. So Dark Hole I'm going to put in D tier. This is a card I could maybe see myself side decking, honestly, in this current format, which again sounds really weird because Dark Hole has not seen play in forever. And again, you might think, like, well, with Raigeki at 2, why would you ever play Dark Hole? But sometimes you want, like, 2 Raigeki and then also some Dark Holes. So I don't know if I'll personally be siding it much this format, but I could definitely see myself in a world where I side, and even in some worlds, even main deck Dark Hole, if you have enough room for like that much like monster destruction. So. All right, next up here we have DD Crow. So DD Crow started gaining a little bit of steam in the last format when Math Mech was super popular because, you know, obviously cards that can banish monsters out of the graveyard or stop monsters from coming back out of the graveyard, that's going to be really good on pretty much exactly diameter for Super Factorial. Indeed, we saw Called By use to great effect against Super Factorial when Math Mech was very popular just before the release of Sprites. In this current format, DD Crow does still have a bit of viability. With Sprite Elf bringing lots of monsters back from the graveyard, you can always just banish whatever the Sprite Elf is targeting. But I will say my thoughts on DD Crow now are pretty much what they were before when Math Mech was the most prominent deck, which is like, DD Crow is not an awful tech, it's not the worst card you could be teching, but in pretty much every single situation, the Ghost Spell is honestly just going to be better. There are situations where DD Crow is better. DD Crow can notably banish spell and trap cards out of the graveyard, which matters a lot more for some matchups than others. It's not that good against Runic though, like, you're not stopping the whole Runic draw, I don't think. You're only just stopping one of the cards, if I recall correctly, because it doesn't actually put the... It's not like Pot of Avarice, where you have to put all the cards back as a condition and then draw. You, upon the resolution of the effect, put the cards back and then draw for Runic Fountain. So, yeah, DD Crow hitting one of the spells is only going to deny them one draw. And then, like I said, most of the time where DD Crow is good, I honestly find that Ghost Spell is just 100% better. So, DD Crow, I'm also going to put in the D tier. There are some very specific decks. I mean, it's pretty much exactly like Tri-Brigade Lyrilusk and Flaunderies, because DD Crow is a level 1 winged beast, might want DD Crow more than Ghost Spell, but otherwise, I think you're going to want Ghost Spell more pretty much every single time. So, DD Crow I'll put down here in D tier with Dark Hole. Alright, Crossout Designator. This is actually one where I really am not sure exactly which tier it should be on. I think in this current meta, I'm going to put it at the bottom of S tier, but I could also see a world where Crossout Designator represents the top of A tier as well. Crossout is kind of one of those cards that, like, most decks generally have room for, but whether or not you play it tends to be format dependent sometimes. I'm hugely up on Crossout Designator, pretty much ever since I started including it in my decks when it was at 3, because even if you're only playing, like, Maxi and Ash Blossom and Called By, and you're not playing many other like staples, like those are still 3 cards that like every single deck is going to have. And not only that, but they're also 3 cards that you really do want to be countering. So Crossout is kind of like Called By in that it's typically used as disruption like counter. But the other thing too is we're obviously in a very sprite heavy meta, and not only just pure sprites, but of course there's many different variants of sprites out there. Sprite is being represented in multiple places across the whole tier list. So if you're playing any of the sprite variants, you almost assuredly should be playing Crossout Designator, because this card in the mirror match can act as a quick play spell version of Solemn Judgment, which is obviously, I don't need to tell you how good that is. And of course, if you're playing any of the sprite variants, then you have the ability to like negate blue, jet, red, carrot, starter, smashers against like any of those matchups. So yeah, I highly recommend Crossout. I mean, again, like I said, I'm generally up on Crossout Designator. I generally include it in all of my, just about all of my decks anyway. I will admit that pre-Sprite, it probably did belong just at the top of A tier and not the bottom of S, but because Sprite is so prevalent, I'm willing to put Crossout Designator at the bottom of S tier here. And because also Maxi is more relevant than ever this format. I mean, it's always been relevant, but now Maxi thanks to Sprites is searchable and recyclable, so being able to counter it I think is more important than ever now. Alright, next up we have Dark Ruler No More. This is a card that I've actually underestimated a bit in the past. I tend to underestimate board breakers a little bit, I will admit, in Master Duel, because it's more of a best of one meta, and board breakers are generally only good going second. You know, of course you're going to be going second a lot of number of times, and arguably in a best of one format, it is good to have a plan for when you go second. But I'm not super up on cards that you open going first and they're just completely dead. That said, Dark Ruler No More does get a significantly bit better this format than it has been previously because of, once again, sprites. So Spright, as I mentioned before when talking about Dark Hole, is very much a heads-up deck. It'll put all of its monsters out on the board and just have them kind of, there ready to interact with you in play. So these power spells that can take care of huge boards of monsters very efficiently are all going to become a significant bit better in this format, and that includes Dark Ruler No More. This is a card I'm actually like kind of on the cusp of main decking in a few decks again, even though I typically don't like to main deck these cards. This card is so effective at stopping Spright boards that I have considered main decking it. In the past, I'd rate it lower, but here in this format, I'm going to put Dark Ruler No More as an A tier staple. That in the past, I'd probably put it more in B or honestly C. I definitely have seen this more as a side deck card before, but now I will say that, again, with Sprite's prevalence and being able to negate Spright boards is so huge. Like, it not only is good because it lets you make plays, but it'll just like completely like cancel out any momentum your opponent had in the game moving forward. It just lets you pick apart their board at your board at their leisure. Now, the other nice thing about Dark Ruler No More is that while you can't inflict battle damage, you can still battle. So if you still need to destroy monsters by battle, Dark Ruler No More does give you the opportunity to do that. Next up, we have Droll and Lockbird. This is a staple, a hand trap that I've been up on for quite a while, especially in the last format. It started to see like a lot more traction. Basically, Droll and Lockbird is good against a lot of decks in the format, but it's most notably not great against Sword Soul, and I think Sword Soul's tier 1 prevalence in the past has kind of like kept Droll and Lockbird from seeing more play, but even in the last format, as we saw Math Mech start to creep up even over Sword Soul and see like as much if not more play than Sword Soul, then that combined with the fact that Droll is good against like pretty much every other deck that's on the tier list, we started to see this card see more play. Now we have Sprites, which also do not all the time, but typically do more than their fair amount of searching. So I think Droll is going to continue to be good in this format, especially as Sword Soul starts to get a little bit less popular. Now, of course, it's not like Sword Soul is dead. It's still a tier 2 deck, and you can still expect to encounter it regularly in tournaments and on ladder. But yeah, the Droll and Lockbird I am definitely going to put in the A tier, which is where I would have put it before as well. This card is very, very good, and if you have the room for it, I would definitely advise teching it. Alright, next up we have another board breaker type card, Forbidden Droplet. I'm generally more up on Forbidden Droplet than other board breaker cards, because like it's also like disruption. It can act as disruption as well. It has a function on turn 1, is basically why I like Forbidden Droplet more than stuff like Dark Ruler No More, and Dark Hole and Raigeki and Lightning Storm and that kind of a thing, because if you open it, you can at least set it, and then you have a disruption for your opponent's turn. The thing about Forbidden Droplet is that it can really only be played in decks that have the extra resources to send with it. And I actually don't think Spright is necessarily one of those decks. It can be. It very much can be, but when you think about your average, at least I'm thinking of like pure Spright end boards, right? Or just, I guess, Spright end boards in general. You know, you've already got your like IP Masquerena, your Carrot, your Red, your Smashers as well. You have all these disruptions already, and they all require you to like utilize cards on your field the same way Forbidden Droplet does. So in that regard, I'm not hugely up on Droplet in Sprites because it feels like it's competing with your other negations for wanting to use your resources to negate. But it does, again, have the flexibility of being a very good going second card as well. So Droplet, I will actually put an A tier, but I'm going to put it under Dark Ruler No More. I actually think Droplet is the better card, but I think more decks can utilize Dark Ruler No More. Read Sprites. I think Sprites more easily utilize Dark Ruler No More than Droplet, which I think puts it slightly higher, but I do think Droplet is overall the stronger and better card, in my opinion. Alright, next up we have Harpy's Feather Duster. Harpy's is pretty much Harpy's Feather Duster is pretty much an internal stay in the A tier, in my opinion. And not just A tier, but like the top of A tier. This is one of those cards where like the only reason it's not an S tier is because some decks just don't have the 40th slot open to put this card in. If this card, like if a deck has a slot open, and I don't need it for like a combo piece, I'm satisfied with like the other tech I've included, then I'll pretty much always include Harpy's Feather Duster. I think in a best of one format, it's just always nice to have. Like, yes, it is only good going second because it, you know, blows up back rows, but I don't think I need to tell you the importance of destroying back rows, especially in this format, you know, where Runic is very much a force and a presence. Being able to start off your turn by getting rid of their fountain is very, very nice. Now, of course, if your opponent's got Hugin, then they can just use the Hugin's effect as well, but to be fair, any Runic deck does not want to end on Hugin at the end of their turn. Like especially Runic Sprite, like, if they end with Hugin up, that means you've disrupted them. That means their hand is not great. So they're already kind of on the back pedal a little bit, arguably speaking anyway. So Harpy's Feather Duster, again, is like eternally on the cusp of being S tier, but I think I'm just going to leave it at the top of A tier. Basically, again, if you have a free 40 slot and you don't know what to do with it, it should probably just be the Feather Duster. Okay, now we have another board breaker card here. This one's going to be Evenly Matched. So Evenly Matched, in my opinion, is a lot like Dark Ruler No More, in that, you know, they both are really only good going second and kind of require you to give up your battle phase. Evenly Matched does just require you to give up your battle phase. Dark Ruler No More just says you can't do battle damage, but Evenly Matched gets to banish all but one card on your opponent's field. Now, as I've mentioned, of course, multiple times by now, I think this type of effect is huge. I think it's massive, being able to break boards because, of course, Spright being the deck that has all the disruptions in play. Evenly, I actually like even a little bit more than Dark Ruler No More, because if you're going to give up your battle phase, in my opinion, you might as well be banishing all of your opponent's stuff instead of just, like, negating it, right? Now, to be fair, if you're playing against a deck, or if you're expecting a lot of decks that make Omni-Negates, like if you're expecting a lot of decks that put out, like, a Baron, or Therion King Regulus, or stuff like that, right? Or even just something that can negate a spell or a trap card, then you want Dark Ruler No More, because Dark Ruler No More, monsters can't respond to it, so your opponent can't use their monster Omni-Negate effect to negate the Dark Ruler No More, whereas they can do that with the Evenly, but the thing is, unless they have the Spright carrot in play, they're not going to be able to negate the Evenly. Sprites won't be able to. So, in that regard, we have this deck where not only do they put a lot of stuff on the field, they don't super often end on a way to negate a spell or trap card. So for that reason, I actually think Evenly is slightly better than Dark Ruler No More in this current format. If we start to see like more just negates out there, then Dark Ruler No More does become the better option, but in this exact format, I think Evenly is actually slightly better. And again, just due to the prevalence of these Spright boards, I think both these cards again would probably be B or C tier in previous formats, but for this format in particular against Spright, definitely both gonna be in the A tier. Alright. Next up, we have the Psyframe Gear Gamma. I'm going to put this card at B. I actually like this card quite a bit in this meta, particularly against pure Spright. You know, when they go to summon Nimble Beaver, Deep Sea Diva, Dark Beckoning Beast, any of these level 2 monsters that have effects that activate when they're summoned, Gamma can negate and destroy them, which means not only have you denied your opponent setting up with those monsters, but they won't have any more level 2 monsters in play, so their Sprites will not be able to special summon themselves to the field. The drawback of Gamma, of course, is that you have to run Psyframe Driver, and opening a 2500 vanilla level 6 monster, or 5, whatever it is obviously far from ideal. So, in that regard, Gamma is going to be in B tier, because it's a good tech, but not every deck can or wants to use it. It's very good in Tri-Brigade decks, because you can obviously just put the driver if you draw it back with Ferrigite or the Bearbrum. It's also notably good in like 60 card decks because you have a much less chance of drawing the driver, so on and so forth. So very, very good tech, but not every deck is able to make use of it. Now we have Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion. This card it honestly has been very, very good for quite some time. I've teched it in a lot of decks. It's interesting, right? Last format, I absolutely, or like pre-Spright Math Mech, I absolutely would have put this in A tier, and I probably would have put this pretty high up in A tier. I think right now, I kind of want to put it at the top of B tier. It's not a bad card by any means to tech, but it's just not impactful enough, right? It was super impactful against Mathmech, where we were stopping their super factorial just all together, and that just completely shuts down any interaction your opponent's got for your turn, which is huge when you're playing against Mathmech. But against Spright, like, yeah, this can negate like Spright Elf, but that's really not enough to stop the opponent, especially if they've set up to the point where they have a Spright Elf in play. They probably have like just more extensions beyond that. That's actually kind of the thing about Spright, is that these kind of like single instance like negations don't really do a whole lot against them, because you really need like 3 of them to fully stop most Spright plays. So Ghost Spell, again, not bad by any means, but I'll put it here in the B tier. Alright, next up we have Ghost Ogre. This is a card that people have started to turn to counter the Gigantic Spright, and then also, of course, the Runic Fountain as well. Ghost Ogre is notably pretty good against face-up spell and trap cards, because if those are destroyed while they're resolving, like a field or a continuous spell, then it won't get the effect. So yeah, being able to be used against Gigantic Spright and the Runic Fountain again is very, very good for Ghost Ogre. I will say though that there are some times where Ghost Ogre is like, there's some matchups where Ghost Ogre is just not great. You just don't really have a good target for it. And even against, sprites and stuff, as I just mentioned, one disruption is oftentimes not enough to stop them. And yeah, the Ghost Ogre on the Gigantic Spright hurts, because also the Gigantic Spright won't resolve because it didn't detach a material. But it's also not uncommon for your opponent to still have plays beyond that. So I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence of Ghost Ogre. I've teched it myself. I've thought about teching it rather myself a couple of times, but just haven't had the room for it. I kind of want to put it in upper C, but I'll put it at the bottom of B. I'll put Ghost Ogre at the bottom of B. I think that's probably closer to where it should be. But it's close. I think you could argue this being in C tier as well. Infinite Permanence is going to be a pretty easy S tier card. I think I'll put it even here above Call By and Crossout. This card has definitely been a staple for pretty much the entirety of Master Duel. It does kind of wax and wane sometimes whether or not it's good. Particularly this last format, I was not super up on Imperm because Mathmech was so prominent, and Linguribo, that deck makes Linguribo all the time to negate trap cards. Also, as people were taking stuff against other trap cards, Imperm then in turn became less impactful. Now, however, though, I think that the Imperm is hugely impactful, because particularly disruptions that aren't monsters are very, very good because of the prominence of Triple Tactics Talent, which we'll cover when we get to that card. But yeah, with Talent being as prevalent as it is, I think having a disruption that's not a monster effect is important. So I know I just said that these single instance like negations or disruptions typically aren't enough to deal with the Spright decks, and they're typically not, to be fair, but that doesn't mean they're bad, and sometimes they are just enough. So if you're going to include those negations, I think I would turn to 3 Imperm first. Alright, next up we have Lava Golem. I'm also going to kind of encompass Kaijus in general with Lava Golem, but Lava Golem is a notable distinction from Kaijus because it does require your opponent to have 2 monsters, and it also eats your normal summon. You can't normal summon during the turn you play Lava Golem. So Lava Golem we've obviously been seeing a lot more of because of Runic Spright being a thing. Runic Spright is a deck that can very easily get away with playing Lava Golem because they don't really need their normal summon to commit a lot of plays, which is not true of like pretty much every single other deck in this format, right? Except for like Mathmech. Mathmech doesn't really need its normal summon sometimes, especially if it's OTKing. But that's why you would side Lava Golem, because Lava Golem would be good going second. So being that Lava Golem is a good card in this meta, but only good in very specific decks or in the side deck, I'm going to put it in C tier. I'll put it below Cosmic Cyclone. I do think Cosmic Cyclone's overall better than Lava Golem. Again, it might seem weird to put Lava Golem here in C tier, but just remember that just because Runic Spright is using it at 3, doesn't mean that every single deck can be utilizing it to just as great effect. And Kaijus in general, I probably just put in C tier as well. There's not really too many like huge things you want to towers, or like any kind of like huge towers you want to send away with a Kaiju. You can hit like an IP or a Spright Elf at the start of your main phase. Your opponent really won't have a chance to respond with those, but the Kaijus only hit one of them. That's kind of why Lava Golem is the go-to choice in Runic Spright, is because it can eat both IP and Spright Elf. Just multiple monsters in general Again, with with Spright putting all of their monsters on board, it's it's pretty easy to play these board breakers and have them have a huge impact. Speaking of board breakers with huge impacts, next up we have Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm, The only problem I have with Lightning Storm is that it doesn't really hit, I guess to be fair, it doesn't really matter that it doesn't hit red or carrot. Really, the biggest issue with Lightning Storm is that it's very much like Dark Hole, that it's really only good when you're going second, exactly when you're going second, and exactly on your first turn going second. So, in that regard, I personally consider it more of a sideboard card, but as I've said with all these other board wiping kind of power spell effects, it does become a lot more viable to main deck it now that sprites are a thing. So, Lightning Storm, I'm going to put in C tier. It's probably about on par with Cosmic Cyclone as far as like main decking it. I'll put it a little bit above though. Do I even have to, Maxi, do I even have to like, yeah, do I even have to talk about this card? Like, do I even have to talk about Maxi? I don't have to explain why this card is good, right? I don't have to explain why this card is at the top of the tier list, right? Okay, cool, good, moving on. So, Nibiru the Primal Being. This is actually a card I was pretty eager to talk about because I've seen, and of course, because this is to be expected, I've seen a lot of people say, like, why would anyone run Nibiru right now? Gigantic Spright just turns it off. There's no point. This could not be further from the truth. Yes, Gigantic Spright does give the deck an easy way to play around Nibiru, but that doesn't mean Nibiru is going to be dead every time. Not even against Spright. Like, you might hear me say that, like, oh yeah, sure, Nibiru against other decks, so most decks are Spright decks. Nibiru is still good against Spright. Like, don't let Gigantic Spright's text trick you into thinking this card is suddenly bad for some reason. So I'm just going to say this. I think Nibiru is an S tier staple, and I think it's always been an S tier staple. Always has been, like the meme. It's really, honestly, and in a more objective standpoint, probably closer to where Feather Duster is, the top of A. And I think that is where I'll put it, at the top of A. But this is a card that I could very easily argue being an S tier. Yeah, like I said, just because Gigantic Spright is a thing doesn't mean that Nibiru is bad. There are a lot of hands where Spright has to play 5 summons leading up to the Gigantic Spright. And then, of course, if you have like a negation for the Gigantic Spright, like an Imperm or something, or if you disrupt it with like Ghost Ogre or something like that, then if your opponent's got follow-up plays, you can just, slap them with the Nibiru later in the turn. So, and then, of course, it is a valid argument that, like, yeah, while the majority of the field might be Spright, or, like, while a lot of the field might be Spright, the majority of the field is still going to be non-Spright decks, and, the Nibiru is still very, very good against a lot of decks in the meta, so I'm still really up on Nibiru. I think, generally speaking, you probably should just be playing this card. I've said before, if you're playing Maxi, you should be playing Nibiru. I think that's still the case. I personally think Nibiru is an S tier staple. I put it in 90% or more of my decks, but again, a more objective standpoint, I will admit, Nibiru is probably just the top of A tier here. Alright, next up we have Raigeki. So Raigeki, much like Dark Hole and Lava Golem and Lightning Storm, is very good for, and Dark Ruler no more, Forbidden Drop evenly. It's a board breaker for monsters. Monster board breakers are especially good right now. Raigeki, I could actually see a world where I main deck it. I really almost did, actually, in one of the decks I'm testing for the next MCS. I really considered main decking a couple of Raigekis, but if you're not main decking it, I think you should definitely be side decking this card. I am going to put it in C tier, and I'll even put it above Lightning Storm, because in this particular meta, I actually think Raigeki has a little bit more utility than Lightning Storm. I don't know. It's debatable. These two are very, very close. These three, honestly, Raigeki, Lightning Storm, Cosmic Cyclone, these three are all very, very close for, like, I would definitely side deck these, and maybe in certain decks in a certain world, even main deck a copy or two, but, yeah, so there's Raigeki. Red Reboot was a lot better in the Math Mech, or in the pre-Spright meta in general, because not just against Math Mech, but every deck in general had like a really powerful trap card that wanted to resolve. Like Sword Souls had Blackout, Branded Despia has Branded Banishment, and then of course like Math Mech has a Super Factorial, Imperm always prevalent. So that said, Spright does not really have any trap cards that it plays besides like Imperm or sometimes Evenly or like some other random tech. So in that case, in that regard, Red Reboot has fallen way down. Red Reboot was definitely an A tier staple in my opinion before Sprites came out. Now that Sprites are out, I gotta put it like down here at the bottom of C. Like maybe you could main deck this, but like it's pretty much just a sideboard card at this point. Dimension Shifter. Dimension Shifter is a card that I think is pretty eternally just been like bottom of B, upper C tier, because like it's a card that's really powerful, but it's so few decks can actually make use of it, because the banish will go on for 2 turns, so it'll be going on during one of your turns as well. And there are just so few decks that can actually like that want to play this and can also withstand the banishing. You know what? I think I am actually going to put it at the top of C tier. Again, not because of its power level. Power level wise, it's definitely more like an A tier staple, but there's just so few decks that can actually use it right now. Like it's, I guess, I don't know. To be fair, like before it was just Flaunderies, now we have Exorcisters, and then some Sprite decks can actually make use of the shifters, and I've actually kind of thought about side decking Shifter even in Sprite myself. I've seen a couple of Sprite variants even main deck it. That's a little, that's definitely a little ballsy in my opinion, but like it's not like the worst choice in the world. So yeah, I think I'll just leave Shifter up here at the top of C. It really could be the bottom of B tier. I could really see that being the case. All right, Solemn Judgment. Solemn Judgment is very much a card that only specific decks can really truly make use of. It's not a bad staple card to have because back row based decks definitely want it, but back row based decks are pretty much the only decks that are going to really truly be able to utilize Solemn Judgment at its full potential. For that reason, I'm just going to throw Solemn Judgment down here in D tier. If you're playing something like Labyrinth or like any kind of Floodgate based deck, then yeah, Solemn Judgment is going to be very great. It's typically good against those back row based decks because it's just good at stopping board wipes, and that typically matters. Like there's fewer ways to protect back rows from board wipes than monsters. Monsters are also a lot more recurable than spell and trap cards, so like if a board of monsters gets wiped, it's like, okay, I can bring that back later, or I can just continue my combo with other monsters. But getting your spell and trap cards that you've just set wiped, that's obviously a lot more impactful, so definitely like having the Solemn Judgment to protect those. Let me take a sip of water here real quick before I talk about Triple Tactics Talent. I think this card is huge in this meta. This card was definitely very good before as well, being able to be used when your opponent like maxes you or Ash Blossoms you during your main phase, or just uses other like monster-based disruption or any kind of like monster effect really. But now, of course, with Sprite Elf activating on like 30% of your total turns in Master Duel, this card becomes a lot more consistent. It's also really nice to have either going first or second, because if you're going first and you get like Max Seed or something, or just again Veilered or something during the main phase, you can look at your opponent's hand and rip out a card to make sure that they're not going to have plays on their turn either. And then if it happens going second, you get, you know, hit with a monster effect, then the talent can usually steal an opponent's monster to make OTKing a lot easier. It's funny, I see most people drawing 2 cards with the talent. Draw 2 is definitely the worst mode on this card. Like, I would only draw 2, and I've done this before to be fair, but excuse me. I would only draw 2 cards in a scenario where my opponent has like, I'm going second, my opponent has very few cards in hand, and or I already know what they all are. And my opponent also doesn't really have anything on board for me to really take advantage of. That's really the only case where I probably draw 2 cards with talent. Or I guess if I was really looking for a specific answer or like a specific piece of gas, maybe. But yeah, generally speaking, going first, you want to use this to rip a card out of your opponent's hand, and going second, you want to be stealing one of your opponent's monsters. In any case, to be fair, even if you draw 2 cards, that's still obviously a +1 and very good. Yeah, Triple Tactics Talent. I'll admit I've slept on this card in the past, and I think it's exceptionally good now. So I'm going to put it in A tier, right here, like not quite at the top of A tier, but just below Nibiru and Feather Duster. I would put Talent as then like the next, probably most important staple to play if you have room for it in this meta. And finally, we have Effect Veiler. So Effect Veiler was actually seen a lot more in the previous meta as opposed to Imperm. Although to be fair, in recent metas, these kind of single instance monster effect negations haven't really been like as great as they've been in the past, but because like stuff like Mathmech and Brain to Despia could already play through like one Veiler, and Sprite can absolutely most of the time play through just one effect Veiler. But of course that doesn't mean it's a bad card by any means, and there are still a lot of decks that just lose to an effect Veiler, like Sword Soul. Veiler on Moye is oftentimes just like a death sentence for them. Veiler is still an extremely good card. I still play, usually one copy along my 3 imperms and a good number of decks. So Veiler, I'll put an A tier. I'll put it above Joel and Lockbird. I think this is about where Veiler is. So boom, here it is. Here you have my staples tier list. Looking at it here, I am actually really satisfied with the placement of all these. I don't really feel the need to rearrange any of these. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree about like Cosmic Cyclone, but whatever, that's fine. I think, I don't know, maybe I just undervalue the card, but I really do think people in general overvalue Cosmic Cyclone. Again, it is better in this format than it was before. It's better against Runic Sprite, much better against Runic Sprite than it was against Stun Runic, but I digress. Alright, so there is the tier list. Wow, I did not intend to go on for this long, but here we are. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments below about where you would put all these staples and what techs that you're playing in your decks this format. But, okay, yeah, I think without further ado, let's just go ahead and move on to the outro. Alright, everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack, you'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now. So without further ado, this is XLex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.